So absolutely enormous balance changes are at large in Warhammer 40k. Let's talk about the changes for the boys in power armour. Which Space Marine units are looking best and worst after the great update? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today, following on from the great big balance update with the Dataslate and all the points updates, I thought we'd go through a few factions and talk about some of the winners and losers from them. And let's start out with the Space Marines, who really had quite a lot altered, mostly for the better, though a few things for the worst. Prior to this in 10th edition, the Space Marines have kind of been a lower mid-tier faction, I'd argue. For win rates at grand tournaments, they've been around about 44%, definitely lower than most, but better than some. They do have a good unit pool, though quite a lot of lists tend to converge on certain units that get played quite a lot. In Games Workshop's balanced Dataslate update, there have been some big points changes, mostly buffs, though a few choice nerfs to certain strong units, probably a bit better internal balance in the index overall as a result. And besides all the core rules changes, there was just the one key Space Marine rules nerf. Primaris Desolation squads going to 5-man units. Unlike most other armies though, Space Marines are expecting a new codex in the not too distant future. That's probably going to turn quite a lot of these updates on their head. They'll be getting a whole bunch of detachments which might emphasise or de-emphasise certain units, likely a whole bunch of rules and datasheet changes, and maybe some rules updates thrown into the mix as well. I'd guess that that's probably coming within the next couple of months or so at the very most, but that still leaves us quite a lot of time to play before the codex comes out. So in this video I thought I'd talk through all the updated units focusing on the core index. Hopefully I'll try and cover the divergent chapters in another video if time permits. First up, we've got the core rules changes for Codex Space Marines, most of which I'd say aren't enormously impactful bar one. I feel like the Devastating Wounds change maybe isn't the worst for Space Marines. That's the one where Devastating Wounds don't become mortal wounds anymore, so they can't splash over and kill multiple models, but for the most part Space Marine Devastating Wound weapons tend to be things that are damage 1 anyway. Things like Gatling cannons, assault cannons, and stern guard bolters. I guess a few things like Eliminator las fusils and thunder hammers on assault terminators might come out a little bit worse out of that, though it kind of depends on what they're fighting. In general, the Devastating Wound change might be helpful against some armies. Say for example, Space Marine Stern Guard's Devastating Wounds will go straight through defences like Custodes' defence against mortal wounds, though I guess on the flip side it is a bit of a nerf to the Terminator Chaplain. He's got a defense against mortal wounds as a feel no pain type save, so it might just be a little bit less tempting to take him along, given that that's not really as relevant as it used to be with lots of devastating wound things out there. By far the biggest core rule change for the Space Marines though is definitely the one to free stratagems and battle tactics. That change was that if there's anything that modifies the cost of stratagems, it can only apply to battle tactics and not other things. And that means that Space Marine captains in general have just declined in a lot of use. I feel like Space Marine captains are just particularly hard hit than that compared with the vast majority of other factions, just because Space Marines have so many different varieties of captains and they're relevant to so many different units. At least for a lot of other factions they tend to be restricted to just buffing options for a few things in their index, not pretty much every unit out there. They've lost access to a whole bunch of really quite powerful things, including free Overwatch, though I still don't think that they're perhaps completely out of the running. Basically, the stratagems that you'd be using now are Armour of Contempt for the most part in the enemy turn. Freely getting slightly tougher armour isn't the worst thing in the world. And then I guess one of the damage dealer ones in your turn are the Storm of Fire or Honour the Chapter, depending on whether you're a ranged or melee unit, just to make their damage a little bit more impactful. Overall though, I'd still definitely say that it's a blow to captains. They've definitely lost a lot of flexibility, and I feel like a few people might be a bit more tempted by the other characters as a result. Otherwise, for the core rules changes, the Overwatch changes I don't think are enormously impactful to them. Marines having okay leadership is perhaps not the worst thing from a insane bravery nerf perspective, and the towering changes aren't very relevant to them. I guess it might help them hide from knights and things, I suppose. As mentioned, perhaps the single biggest change to the Space Marine units is the Desolation Marines, which have been nerfed very heavily. Not only have they got a points nerf going up from 170 to 200 points, so that's a 17% nerf there, so fairly severe, but they've also had their squad size capped at 5 as well, and that's really quite a big blow in itself. I think it's just going to be hard to justify including an apothecary with bolter discipline in it to buff their shooting anymore. The numbers just don't really quite work out as worth it, I think. Stratagems like Storm of Fire are going to be less efficient, and if you just wanted to absolutely spam Desolation Marines, not saying that you necessarily want to, but you can only get up to 15 of them now. All of that for the core index means that I think they're going to be quite rarely taken now. Their damage output between the indirect fire and the armour busting rounds still isn't the worst in the world, but they're very fragile for the cost, and they were quite regularly being taken in Deathwatch, but they've also been banned from using their special issue ammunition stratagems as well, so that's a big nerf there too. Otherwise though, let's go through the other units: infantry, bikes, vehicle units and characters, and talk through all of those. For the infantry squads, 3 units have been nerfed. The infiltrators have gone up to 100 points from 90, so an 11% nerf there, and Sternguard and the Terminator assault squad have both been nerfed to a lesser extent. I'm maybe a little bit surprised by infiltrators going up quite that much, to be honest. I wouldn't have guessed them to be one of the things that would have been the first thing to attract Games Workshop nerfs. I guess if you just want an objective that's absolutely defended from enemy deep strikers, it's going to cost more of a premium, though I feel like for 100 points it's still not the worst in the world, either a midfield point or your home objective. Sternguard going up I think I could live with, going up to 110. They're still good with Oath of Moment and fishing for devastating wounds, and the Terminator Assault Squad is a bit of a nothingy change really, though when you combine that with the comparison to the regular Terminator Squad, they are losing out in comparison. I'd say all of these are kind of usable, but just a little bit less exciting by comparison. Otherwise, for infantry units though, the Terminators have dropped down to 190 from 205. Already a solid enough unit I think, and that's not going to hurt them at all. I guess they have had some support nerfed with their Terminator Chaplain's Mortal Wound thing and the Captain Free stratagems toned down though. Aggressors I thought were kind of mediocre but have gone down to 100. Blade Guard perhaps similar, gone down to 90. Assault Centurions were pretty weak but have got a very big points drop, going down to 150 for 3 of them. They could be a bit more interesting jumping out of a Land Raider now maybe. And perhaps one of the single biggest winners from the melee infantry are the Vanguard veterans with jump packs, a really massive points cut going from 130 all the way down to 105. I think that's at a point where it's not really too bad for the amount of Strength 5 AP1 hits they put out now, plus getting some Storm Shields. They still might do a little bit less damage than the assault squads given the lack of the impact hits. I guess we'll have to weigh them up against the jump intercessors when the codex comes out. For more bolter wielding and battle line infantry, basically all the intercessors went down. The standard ones are 85, the assault ones are 80, heavies are now 105. I feel like they did kind of need decreases really, not many people were looking at them very seriously compared with all the damage dealing Space Marines, though even at this cost I'm not sure I could see people going massively heavy on them. I feel like they're a unit that you might just want to have limited numbers of to get objectives and things, and then give the rest of the damage dealers prey to fight with otherwise. Incursors I think are quite a nice decrease at 85 points from 90. They're pretty nice with their ability to get a +1 to hit on the enemy unit, and that ability's got cheaper, definitely very usable. Infernus Marines with their Overwatch threat are 85 as well, still maybe a bit middling but very nasty against enemy hordes. Reavers are down to 85 with their morale shenanigans, but given the rest of the decreases I still don't think they're going to stand out. Scouts are 65 from 70, and I think that's quite good for such a cheap squad to start in the midfield. They're really not bad with 2 wounds now. And the Tactical Marines drop down to 160 from 175. Very cheap for putting Marine wounds on the table, and he would have a fairly secure home field objective. Still though, I would say that they compare badly with most of the other squads on this list. Overall pretty reasonable to target most of these with changes I think. A lot of them were kind of underwhelming. Finally, for the range Space Marine units, Devastator Centurions got a similar sort of scale drop to the assault ones. They're 175 for the chunky guys with the twin las cannons. Still probably going from kind of bad to merely okay though, as opposed to standout good. On the other hand though, I'd say that the Eliminators might be one of the single most improved units out of the entire index. They were already fairly usable before at 95 points with their move, shoot, move and either las fusils or snipers. They've got one of the biggest proportional decreases out of the index, and I feel like they're very usable indeed now. Have a couple of them to either screen out the enemy being at the front of the field, and you can definitely play them in different ways, utilising their las fusils or damage output if it makes more sense than just having them as trading pieces. Finally, Suppressors got, I feel like, a fairly well-deserved decrease, 11% down to 85 points. If you want autocannon shooting, then they're okay for that now. Previously I thought they were overcosted. I'm mainly going to focus on the units with changes today, but there were a few fairly solid infantry units left untouched. Inceptors in particular I think are really quite competitive with their close drop rule, very nice for secondaries and things, and they remain good. Hellblasters are still in a very good place, could be another good target for bolter discipline warlord traits if you're not using it on Desolation Marines anymore. And Eradicators still do anti-tank pretty decently efficiently, though they are a bit inflexible and needing to get close. There are quite a lot of things in the index that haven't really seen any points cuts that are the ones that are going to Legends in the not too distant future. I guess Games Workshop's policy is not to mess around with those too much, particularly if they're not going to be a thing in the future. Bike units next, and the Outriders are down to 105 from 115, a fairly solid points cut, but they were fairly underwhelming before. I'm still not sure this is really going to get them there, given that they don't really do much besides against lighter infantry. The Invader ATV takes a slightly bigger cut, down to 70 points. I feel like that's maybe a little bit more interesting as well. Reasonably fast and reasonable firepower. One or two of them is looking better than it was. Next up, we've got the vehicle units, and let's take a look at the Primaris ones, then talk through the Firstborn changes. For the Primaris vehicles, there were 3 major nerfs: the Gladiator Lancer going up to 160 points, the Stormspeeder Hellstrike to 140, and the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to 170. Admittedly, all of those were pretty solid units that popped up really quite regularly in competitive lists. The Gladiator Lancer more so than most perhaps. It was rare to see a competitive Marine list that didn't include at least a couple of them. I think it'll still be good at 160 points, and they've decreased the cost on the other 2 Gladiators, the Reaper and the Valiant, so a bit more internal balance between the 3 there, as the Lancer was pretty much clearly the best with the big rerolls it gets. The Stormspeeders I think are kind of fine, but are pushing it a little bit now for their durability. They do have powerful special rules, but for their defense for the cost it's really not all that overwhelming, and the Stormspeeder Hellstrike's damage output just isn't that great. Otherwise, for Redemptor Dreadnoughts, it's decreases across all 3 of them. The Redemptor's down 7%, so 225 to 210 there. The Brutalis sees an enormous points cut, going down to 175 from 220, and the Ballistus in the new Leviathan box set goes down to 150. Definitely looking a lot more credible as an anti-armor gun turret compared with the Predator Annihilator and the Gladiator Lancer now. I did think it was overcosted before. Good thing if you own Redemptor chassis, I suppose. The Redemptor Dreadnought was definitely the most played out of them, and now the points actually reflect that at 210. The -1 damage is still really big for that. I feel like with that kind of points cut though, the Brutalis is probably getting to the same sort of level as the Redemptor. It is fearsome in combat and has good anti-tank firepower if you get those multi-melters in close. The Invictus 150 from 160, still kind of fine. I don't think that's enough to make it massively stand out. And then the Impulsor has got maybe one of the best changes out of these, I think. Literally just 85 points for the Primaris Transport is looking very, very good right now. I think that's genuinely very tempting for its defensive profile, plus something like a rocket or a whole bunch of stubber shots on the top, all while delivering some Blade Guard or Hellblasters into battle. Out of these, I'd say perhaps the biggest winners are the Impulsor, the Redemptor Dreadnought, and the Brutalis perhaps, though I still think that the Gladiator Lancer is cheap enough that it's still going to get taken. For units not touched by the update, the Repulsors I think are worth mentioning too. Lots of people were taking Repulsor Executioners, and they did compete at least fairly well with the Lancer. This might be enough to just about put them ahead. You do get a lot of wounds and quite a lot of general purpose firepower with its secondary weapons. Then for the Firstborn vehicles, there's points cuts on most of them, besides the couple that I would have considered best, the Whirlwind and the Predator Annihilator. The Land Raiders all see genuinely solid points cuts, the regular one's 240 from 275, the Crusader's 230, and the Land Raider Redeemer is 260 with its big Overwatch threat. Those are pretty reasonable points cuts there, and I feel like they're going to be a lot more interesting for delivering combat units into melee. Maybe could be interesting for Terminators, or throwing Blade Guard or Aggressors up the board. It would be really interesting if we actually started seeing Land Raiders being played regularly. The Predator Destructor gets a small points cut, but it's not enough to make it better than the Annihilator. The Vindicator goes down to 190, but that's still too much for what it does, I think. And the Rhino's down for 75 points, though I think its main issue is a lack of good units to transport for the most part. I guess maybe you might be looking at Devastators here now. I feel like Tactical Marines might not just do enough to really justify the transport. I suppose it could put some fast bodies down on the midfield objectives for the opponent to chew on. Out of these ones, I'd rate the Land Raiders as perhaps the most interesting change. If you did want to build around delivering a big melee unit to the front via a Land Raider or Redeemer or something, then it's now a lot easier. Then finally we've got the characters, just a few decreases on the generic characters, a lot of which look like they're going to be going to Legends for the Firstborn variants in the Codex. The Gravis Captain I think has come out okay, 80 points from 95, so that's probably enough to compensate him for the limited stratagem access. He does have some pretty nice defensive and assault stats. For the Lieutenants, the Reaver Lieutenant's gone down to 60 points, though it's probably quite niche joining things like Reavers compared with the Phobos one. and the combi weapon lieutenant from the Leviathan box has dropped to 70 from 80 with his lone operative shenanigans and marking an enemy objective. Still competes kind of poorly for lone operatives versus something like a Vindicare assassin, I'd say though. Finally, we've got the named characters, where I perhaps feel like percentage decreases maybe aren't quite as meaningful given that they're just single 1-unit upgrades. There's just the one nerf out of these, and that's to the Primarch himself. Rabute Gilliman goes up from 355 to 380. Looks like Double Oath is coming at more of a price now, and he'll also have taken the nerfs from Devastating Wounds and his stratagem ability going down, so not a very good update for him, I guess. Otherwise though, for a lot of the rest, they just feel like they're generally feels-good choices for your choice of chapter. I think this is perhaps kind of deliberately so, and just gives you some reason to play your Marines as, say, Iron Hands, or Imperial Fist, or Raven Guard. It's probably not the worst game design to have their characters actually slightly undercosted compared with other things, as the impact's going to be kind of limited on any one miniature. I feel like the vast majority of these you wouldn't feel too bad about taking them. For standout choices, I still think that Tigerius adds some pretty excellent value for 80 points. He's got genuinely dangerous damage output, makes his squad harder to kill, and his free stratagems actually specify the ones that you can use, so in some respects he's actually more powerful than the captain in that way. Calgar farms CP and just has good stats and advance and charge things. Vulcan Estan looks like an absolute steal for the Salamanders at 80 points for the Torrent and Melter rerolls. And as mentioned, I do feel that basically most of the rest look kind of fine really. Overall, I'd say it's a broadly positive update for the Space Marines. Definitely numerically, there's a lot more buffs than there are nerfs, though it's kind of a little bit deceptive, as if you nerf the best stuff, a lot of the worst stuff would have to catch up by quite a lot to replace it. Out of this update, I'd perhaps say things like Eliminators, Vanguard Veterans, the Redemptor Brutalis Dreadnoughts, and the Impulsor are some of the biggest winners. Most of the chapter-specific characters got a little bit better, and of course any already good stuff that remained untouched is still going to be great now. Perhaps things like Repulsors and Hellblasters are worth a mention there. For the biggest losers, I feel like chief amongst them are probably the Desolation squads and the captains with their limited stratagems now. Gladiator Lancers are definitely toned down, but still alright. I feel like they've probably not been too punitive with most of the actual points nerfs. The units have more gone to acceptably playable as opposed to outright bad. Overall, I'd say broadly a small buff, but probably not a huge one really. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the Space Marine state in 10th edition from this update. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'll aim to have a few more updates similar to this on other factions from the balanced data slate. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support there. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.